Bom dia, pessoal. Nós estamos ao vivo aqui com o professor James Harris. Eu vou brevemente explicar como vai funcionar a nossa live e apresentar o professor James, depois passar a palavra para ele, ele vai fazer a apresentação dele sobre o tema, né, o ato pelo qual um povo é um povo, a teoria do povo de Rousseau. E nós vamos ter a apresentação em um bloco de cerca de 40 minutos. Quem tiver aqui conosco, assistindo pelo YouTube, participando na sala, após esse bloco vai poder elaborar perguntas. O pessoal do YouTube pode elaborar as perguntas como preferir, em português e em inglês, e a gente aqui traduz para o professor James, e o pessoal da sala a mesma coisa, né? O professor James, que é desde 2004 vinculado à Universidade de St. Andrews, na Escócia, né? Tem como formação uma graduação em língua inglesa e literatura pelo Balliol College de Oxford, e ele mais tarde volta para Oxford novamente para fazer um BPhil, que seria equivalente aqui ao nosso mestrado em filosofia, com a tese A Teoria da Liberdade de Kant na Crítica da Razão Pura, né? E depois o doutorado em filosofia também pela Universidade de Oxford, St. Catherine's College, sob a supervisão do professor Galen Strawson e do professor Ralph Walker, com o tema O Problema do Livre-Arbítrio na Filosofia Britânica do século XVIII. Né? Atualmente, o professor James é o diretor da Escola de Estudos Filosóficos, Antropológicos e de Cinema da Universidade de St. Andrews, e ele é conhecido aí, principalmente pela grande quantidade de artigos publicados sobre Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, e David Hume, especialmente, né, a biografia intelectual do David Hume. O professor James é autor desse livro, né, e tem amplo reconhecimento na comunidade europeia e, claro, na comunidade britânica pelas contribuições dele, sobretudo aos estudos do século XVIII. Então, para mim, é um prazer pessoal receber o professor James aqui hoje, tendo em vista que ele foi meu supervisor, meu host, né, durante o meu período na Universidade de St. Andrews, no ano passado. Foi um supervisor muito generoso, sempre disposto a boas reuniões, e hoje, mais uma vez, generosamente, ele vem aqui compartilhar com a gente esse mais novo artigo em que ele está trabalhando, né? E eu acho que é um privilégio para todos nós poder compartilhar com ele da construção desse artigo em desenvolvimento. So, good afternoon, good morning, Professor James. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I just made a little introduction about yourself, which is not even necessary, being who you are. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I emphasize what a gracious host you were for me and Veronica during our period in Scotland. And now the floor is yours. You have your 40-ish minutes to talk to us about the act by which a people is a people, Rousseau's theory of the people. Thank you very much, Professor James.
Well, thank you, Flavio, for those kind words, and thank you everybody for being here today. I appreciate that it's only 10 in the morning where you are. It's 1 in the afternoon where I am. It's kind of amazing that technology enables us to communicate and share ideas in this way, you being, us being thousands of miles apart and very, very different places. It's a great privilege to be able to take advantage of that technology and to be able to share some ideas with you today about Rousseau. I want to apologize for not being able to speak with you in Portuguese. It's an amazing stroke of luck that we native speakers of English have, that everybody around the world speaks our language, and more or less anyway, and enables us to communicate in all sorts of different places around the world in English. It is something that I certainly don't take for granted. I'm very appreciative of. Anyway, I want to talk to you today about the political thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But before I do that, I thought I would just give you a sense of the larger project of which this piece of work is a part. So for a while now, I've been working on a project concerning theories of the people in modern political thought. That's to say, theories about how a nation or a country can be said to be unified in such a way as that there is a single thing that we can talk about in the singular rather than in the plural, a thing called the people, which could be said to have a single will, when we talk about the people's will, the will of the people, and also a capacity for action, and possibly also other attributes as well, potentially sovereignty, of course, one of the principal supposed attributes of the people. My interest is not so much in popular sovereignty as such, about which a great deal has been written, but it's more in the prior question of how it is that there is such a thing as the people at all. Of course, the people is an essential part of the theory of democracy. Democracy supposes the existence of something called the people, arguably anyway. So my interest is in, how is almost a metaphysical question, or an issue in the metaphysics of politics, if you like. How is a thing called the people possible? How is the plurality of a nation, of a country, unified so as to be something called a people? Now, this turns out to be quite an old question that people are already, the philosophers and theorists are already talking about in the 16th and 17th centuries, after the idea of popular sovereignty comes onto the political stage, as it were, as a way not of motivating democracy, but of certainly limiting the power of kings and of, as it were, resituating royal power such that it is supposed to be derived from the people rather than from God. So the people comes onto the political stage in the 16th, 17th century in Europe, and that raises the question of what a people is and how a people is different from other social organizations, how political unity is possible. So I'm interested in various different answers to that question, beginning the most important sort of theorist at the start of my story is Hobbes, and I've come to the kind of provisional conclusion that theories of the people can sort of be situated on a spectrum, if you like, with Hobbes at one end of the spectrum and Rousseau at the other. What I mean by that might become a little bit clearer over the course of the talk. So this is part of a larger project then about theories of the people. And in the context of that project, I'm trying to get clear about what Rousseau's theory of the people might be. Now, thinking about that question takes us right to the heart of Rousseau's political thought as he understands it himself. So we can begin with, so just let me step back a minute. You've got a handout with the structure of my argument on it, and with also a large number of quotations on it. Now, I'm not going to, each time I refer to one of those quotations or use it, say, this is quotation 17 or whatever. You can just follow along. But anyway, the first of those quotations is from Rousseau's Letters Written from the Mountain, a work he wrote relatively late in his life. And here he is reflecting on his own political thought and trying to explain what it was that he was doing in his great text, The Social Contract. And he describes himself as beginning with the question, what is it that makes the state one? What is it that makes the state a unity? And that, he says, what makes a state one is the union of its members, a union which has its source in the obligations which link or connect those members. So the next question is, well, what's the ground of that obligation? And Rousseau considers various possible answers to that question. One might be force, mere strength. One might be the supposed authority of the father. In other words, the king might be a kind of father figure who unifies the state insofar as all subjects have the obligation of children towards their father. It might also be the will of God. Rousseau rejects all of those possibilities and says, and this of course is no surprise if you know anything at all about Rousseau, that the foundation of unity is a contract, a convention that all members of the state make. So the social unity has its origin in this contract. In his text, The Social Contract, Rousseau describes the various ways in which we talk about this unity. We call the political unity a state when it's passive. We call it a sovereign when it's active. We call it a power when we compare it with other states. Power, the European powers, different countries, and also we have different names for those who are members of the state. They call themselves citizens when they think of themselves as participants in sovereign authority. They call themselves subjects when they think of themselves as obliged to obey the law. And when they think of themselves as a collectivity, they call themselves a people. So my question is, well, what does Rousseau mean by a people exactly? How is he thinking of peoplehood? And my argument will be that he has a distinctive and, as you might say, a very demanding theory of peoplehood. Demanding in the sense that it's not by any means the case that in every country a people exists. In fact, I think, according to Rousseau, probably he would say, he never says this explicitly, but I think probably he would say that in most European countries of his time, and probably also of our time, there is in fact no such thing as the people at all. So that's what I mean by calling it a demanding theory. It has a whole set of conditions which need to be satisfied. And in most modern polities, I think those conditions are not satisfied. So that question, what is a people? What is it that makes the state one? That concern with unity, of course, I think connects Rousseau with Hobbes. Hobbes's political thought is centrally motivated with the question of how the state is one, with the unity of the state. And Hobbes has his own distinctive theory of peoplehood, which is, I think, usefully compared and contrasted with Rousseau's. So for Rousseau, so Hobbes rather, the question of what is a people is entered into by means of a comparison between what he calls the multitude, the multitudo, and populace on the other. A multitude or a crowd lacks unity. It's a kind of chaos of different opinions and different values, whereas a people is substantially unified. And just to remind you, Hobbes's argument is that peoplehood and unity are achieved when essentially citizens consent to the authority of a sovereign power, when they submit to the authority of a sovereign power. So the creation of a sovereign power with the capacity to kind of force citizens and subjects force subjects to become citizens, to obey that sovereign power. The sovereign power has the capacity to kind of create unity by force, if you like. And in a surprising and surely intentionally subversive moment in Hobbes's account of these things in his book De Cive on the Citizen, Hobbes says, in every commonwealth, the people rules. In every commonwealth, the people sovereign. The people is sovereign. Now, that is, of course, a very paradoxical thing to say. How can the people be said to rule in a monarchy, for example? Well, what Hobbes means by that is that when a state is unified in the form of a monarchy, the people rules in the sense that the people exists, peoplehood unity exists in the single will of the sovereign. So even where we've got an absolute monarchy, as it were, the multitude of citizens exist as a unity in the single will, as represented in the single will of the king. So peoplehood and sovereignty go together, according to Hobbes, regardless of the form of sovereignty, whether it's monarchical or aristocratic or democratic. So in every commonwealth, the people reigns, Hobbes says. So one way of sort of characterizing what's happening there, I think, is to say that, so one take on that at least is to think, well, Hobbes just makes it too easy to talk about peoplehood and too easy to talk about popular sovereignty. Wherever there is sovereign power, wherever there is a power capable of unifying the state, then, according to Hobbes, the people rules. As I say, that sounds like that's too easy a way to peoplehood, you might think. It kind of takes, if the whole point of the idea of popular sovereignty is to present a kind of challenge or at least limitation to sovereign power, than monarchical power, rather, than something, Hobbes is doing something kind of subversive of the whole idea of popular sovereignty in his political thought. Rousseau, by contrast, as I'm saying, makes it very hard to talk about peoplehood and sovereignty. There are a whole set of conditions that need to be satisfied. I'm going to be talking about some of them in this talk. So here we have this comparison and contrast between Hobbes on the one hand and Rousseau on the other. In Hobbes, it's too easy to talk about the people. The people has been collapsed into the will of the sovereign, regardless of the kind of political regime that we're talking about. Whereas with Rousseau, it's very hard to instantiate peoplehood. And most regimes, as we know them, don't feature a people. So there we have this contrast. I hope that's reasonably clear between Hobbes on the one hand and Rousseau on the other. Another, just to kind of continue with a kind of situating this in historical context, a crucial figure standing between Rousseau and Hobbes is Samuel Pufendorf, the German jurist and political theorist. Now, what happens with Pufendorf is that he wants to, as it were, reopen the gap between the monarch on the one hand and the people on the other, so that they can be seen to be genuinely different things. Hobbes is collapsing them into each other. Pufendorf wants to pull the monarch apart from the people, and he does this by means of a rather complicated version of social contract theory, which perhaps I don't need to go into here. But I think one way of understanding Rousseau is engaging closely with Pufendorf's critique of Hobbes, and seeking to show that a crucial part of the Pufendorfian story, whereby the people transfers sovereignty to a monarch, is, as it were, a contradiction in terms. For Rousseau, as you probably know, the people can't surrender its sovereignty. The people's sovereignty is inalienable, can't be given to somebody else. So in making that argument, I think we should see Rousseau, as I say, engaging closely with Pufendorf. Anyway, look, so there's the kind of historical framework within which I'm working. Let me now turn to Rousseau's theory of the people and to sort of spell out my argument about the conditions that need to be satisfied for there to be such a thing as a people, according to Rousseau. Before I do that, before I say a little bit more about these conditions that need to be satisfied, I want to just say a little bit about the meaning of the word people in Rousseau and the importance of this concept to Rousseau's political thinking. Because I think that we tend to these days approach political thought with a whole set of presuppositions which are fairly kind of individualist. We're interested in the consequences of making the social contract for individuals who are party to that contract. What are the consequences for individuals for their freedom? How are individuals obliged to obey sovereign authority? What are the limits on individual obligation and so forth? Rousseau, I think, by contrast, comes to political theory with the people right at the front of his mind. The American scholar Richard Boyd has recently talked about the primacy of peoplehood in Rousseau's political thought, and I think that's absolutely right. So Boyd says, rather than thinking of the contract as a deal between sort of previously unaffiliated individuals, when you look closely at Rousseau's text, you see the people is a crucial moment in the genesis of a political community. The freedom that Rousseau is concerned with in his political thought is very often, mostly, I would say, in fact, the freedom of a people rather than the freedom of individuals. When you start looking for this in Rousseau, you find it everywhere that Rousseau is concerned with the freedom of the people, the moral character of the people, and so forth. When he describes his own political thought in texts like the Confessions or Emile, where both of which there are moments in which Rousseau gives his own characterization of his political thinking. You find the people as being the thing with which he's most concerned. Now, saying that raises a difficult question, which I just want to mention, and perhaps we can talk about it later if people are interested in this. But there's a problem here, which is a kind of lack of clarity in Rousseau's own language between, on the one hand, the people, peuple in French, and the nation, la nation. Now, the difficulty here is, I think, that when Rousseau is talking about the people, he's talking about the people as a political agent, the sort of thing that has a single will and so forth, the product of the social contract. This is an artificial entity. It's an inherently political entity. It's formed by a contract. Its primary attribute is sovereignty and so forth. And it's therefore something which seems categorically different from the nation, meaning a historical, cultural unity which is located in a particular place, which has a long history, which precisely isn't artificial but is natural, and which seems like an entirely different kind of thing. And it's tempting to say that on Rousseau's theory that, as it were, the nation is the point of departure for the social contract, and the social contract is a means by which the nation is turned into a people. I think, it would be nice if the story was as clean and simple as that. Unfortunately, Rousseau's language, he often uses people and nation as synonyms, as if they mean the same thing. And sometimes when he's talking about the people, he seems obviously to be not talking about the people as an artificial unity with a single will, possessed of sovereignty and so forth, but talking about something natural with a history and so forth. And most confusingly of all, there are 3 chapters in book 2 of the social contract called The People, which seem in fact to be not so much about the people in this political sense, but about the nation. So it's very confusing how he's using the language. And it's confusing to me. A question I have about Rousseau, and I'd be interested to talk about this, why he uses these 2 really quite different words, quite different concepts, you'd have thought, to talk about political peoplehood. This is confusing, especially because, there was at Rousseau's time a kind of understanding that people and nation were different things. And the paradigm case here being ancient Rome, where there was taken to be a single thing, the Roman people, populus, Romanus populus, composed of, made up out of several different nations, the various nations on the Italian peninsula, for example, single Roman people. And as Rome kind of expanded, it brought these nations into the Roman people and made it part of the Roman people. So this was kind of an established way of thinking about Rome. In France too, there was thought to be a French people comprised of the different nations of Brittany, Provence, Languedoc, and so forth. So as I say, it's a question for me why Rousseau's language is so confusing here, and why he doesn't systematically differentiate between nationhood and peoplehood. Anyway, I mention this in order to emphasize the fact that when I'm talking about a theory of the people, I'm talking about a theory of this artificial, essentially political entity, the people, conceived of as being something categorically different from the nation as a historical, cultural, linguistic, religious, whatever entity. So, focusing on that thing, the single thing, the people, I want to talk about how a people comes into existence, what it is that would make the act by, to use Rousseau's phrase, the act by which a people is a people. That act is, I will argue, is not simply an act of origination. It's not something that sort of happens once and brings the people into existence. It also has a temporal dimension, because there's also the question of not just how the people originates, but how later in time citizens, now how citizens now join this thing called the people and make themselves members of the people. But there's also a further question about how the people maintains itself in existence over time. So it isn't just a one-shot thing that happens and the people exist and it exists forever. The people is an artificial thing. It has no natural principle of subsistence. It needs to be kept alive, as it were. And Rousseau has quite a lot to say about how the people is kept alive and about the difficulties of keeping the people alive. Okay, so let me begin with the original act by which a people is brought into existence. That act is, of course, the contract, the original contract by means of which, to use Hobbes's kind of language, a multitude is unified into a people. Rousseau doesn't use quite that language. He talks about the distinction between an aggregation on the one hand, a mere collection of individuals, and an association, which has unity and purpose and so forth. So how is an aggregation turned into an association? That association being another word for the people. And of course, as I say, as everybody knows, the answer to that question is by means of a contract. Rousseau, of course, not the first person to theorize an original social contract, but his contract is of a very distinctive kind, and essential to understanding Rousseau's theory of peoplehood is to understand exactly how extreme, if you like, this contract is. Rousseau emphasizes the radical nature of the contract when he talks about the contract involving what he calls the total alienation of each associate with all of his rights to the whole community. So I'm not going to spend time now talking about the exact nature of the Rousseauian social contract. We can talk about that in questions if you want, but it's I think Rousseau understands it to be a different kind of contract from the kinds of contracts that have been theorized by Hobbes and Locke and Pufendorf before him. It's a puzzling business because Rousseau is at the one hand trying to use this contract as a means of explaining how the people comes into existence, but at the same time the contract is described by him as a contract made between individuals and the people, which seems to presuppose that the people already exist. So we seem to be in this impossible situation whereby the contract brings the people into existence, but one of the parties of the contract is a people which doesn't yet exist, because the whole point of the contract is to bring the people into existence. So it's hard to understand exactly what's going on here. It's paradoxical, and one of the kind of ways perhaps in which the difficulty of understanding what's happening here, one of the ways in which that's sort of acknowledged by Rousseau himself, is the way in which in Book 2 of the Social Contract he brings in this mysterious figure called the legislator as a way of enabling the original contract. I see this as Rousseau, as I say, acknowledging how hard it is to make sense of this original moment. It seems to be an unaccountable, even a kind of miraculous moment when a people emerges into the continuum of history. And in the language that he uses to describe the act of the legislator, let me just find the quote. Here we are. This is quote number 20 on the handout. Rousseau says there, anyone who dares to institute a people, I understand this as, anybody who dares to turn a nation into a people, give it unity and unity of will, must feel capable of, so to speak, changing human nature, of transforming each individual who by himself is a perfect and solitary whole into a part of a larger whole from which that individual would, as it were, receive his life and being. So it's a radical moment of rupture when a people comes into existence. It involves a changing of human nature. And that is perhaps not something that human beings can do for themselves. That requires this mysterious figure of the legislator to help them along the way. And in other texts in his book on the government of Poland, for example, Rousseau talks about actual legislators who succeeded in doing this. The paradigm case there is the biblical figure Moses, who is described as having turned a swarm of wretched fugitives, the Jews, a wandering and servile troop, into a body politic, a free people, but of course by means of a miracle, by means of going up the mountain and bringing the tablets of the law down and so forth. So this original moment when a people comes into existence is hard to make sense of. But assuming that we can make sense of it, assuming that a people is brought into existence, there is also, as I say, the question of how each of us at later moments in time becomes a moment of, a member of the people. Now, the social contract tradition before Rousseau has used the language of consent to theorize the joining of individuals into the body politic. It's a curious feature of Rousseau's political thinking that he doesn't use that language. I think possibly the reason is that Rousseau sees consenting to authority. That sounds like something kind of passive. You are accepting the power of somebody else. Whereas, of course, for Rousseau, the people is essentially active and autonomous. And the citizen is active and autonomous. Citizenship doesn't seem like the kind, Rousseauian citizenship doesn't seem like the kind of thing which could be kind of expressed and entered into by means of something passive like consent. That's just a suggestion on my part. Should we think of even when it comes to the original moment whereby people is created, or the later moment when people like us join the people, should we conceive of these as actual historical events? How literally should we use this language? I'm not sure. I don't by any means endorse every aspect of the kind of reading of Rousseau that you get in John Rawls and his disciples, but the idea that the social contract is not to be seen as a historical moment, but as something, to use Rawls's words on, I've got this quote on the handout somewhere, quote 22. Rawls talks about what he calls a present time ongoing interpretation of the social contract. This means, he says, that the terms of the social compact arise out of the conditions that always obtain in a society that's well ordered, in Rousseau's sense. And I think that's a helpful way perhaps of understanding what Rousseau means by a social contract, not a historical event, but as it were something which is instantiated in a particular kind of social arrangement. So a social, a kind of social arrangement which would be one that could be the product of a contract, something like that. We could say that a people exists perhaps only for as long as we decide we are going to live together in a certain kind of way, treat each other as equals, and understand our politics to be fundamentally based on equality. If we treat each other in that way, then we are kind of realizing the Rousseauian social contract. Okay, the next question. How is it that the people is maintained in existence? Now, I think it's considering this question which makes it obvious how hard it is to understand contemporary political life, even the political life of Rousseau's own day, in terms of peoples in Rousseau's sense. Because Rousseau is pretty clear in the later sections of Book 2 of the Social Contract, but most of all in Books 3 and 4 of a Social Contract, that peoplehood is an active business that is expressed most fundamentally in the assembly of the people. Rousseau talks about this. I think he means it literally, that the people needs to assemble, it needs to legislate in order to be a people, in order to be a body that has a single sovereign will and that is continually asserting that will. For Rousseau, I think will is not something, as we know, it's not something that can be alienated and represented. It's not something, I think, also which kind of exists in a single moment in time. It has to be continually reasserted. And the people's will, in other words, people needs to assemble, the people needs to consider law, consider whether laws, fundamental constitutional laws need to be remade. It needs to think about remaking the constitution. There need to be moments, regular moments, in which the people meets to consider fundamental political questions. And this is absolutely essential if the people's going to maintain its control over government. Government is essential to Rousseauian politics, but it's also dangerous to Rousseauian politics. The government is continually trying to usurp the authority of the people, and the people fights back, if you like, against its government by assembling, by asserting its control over the government, by asserting its control, most importantly, over the constitution, and preventing the government from usurping the power of the constitution, from changing the constitution in dangerous ways. So Rousseauian peoplehood and citizenship are active, and that requires the people to gather. Now, of course, this, a classic objection to popular sovereignty and democracy in the modern world is that, the population is basically just too large to gather together in one place in any meaningful sense. I think that's right, and Rousseau understands the force of that thought, but he introduces and gives a interesting description of the Roman Republic in Book 4 of the Social Contract, precisely in order to show that even in a very large state, I mean, not really large in modern terms, but large in terms of the ancient world, even in terms of a very large state, the people is able to gather and vote and assert its control over the government. The description of the Roman constitution is supposed to show how they succeeded in doing this in ancient Rome. It's a complicated arrangement whereby various different kind of subdivisions of the people gather and their votes kind of add up and count against each other in various complicated ways. But the point of it for Rousseau is to show how popular sovereignty can work in a large state. But I think the point is that this absolutely has to happen, that the people has to assemble, and where a people doesn't assemble as a single body, asserting a single will, then really the people just doesn't exist. There's a nice quote from Carl Schmitt. I mean, Schmitt's a complicated figure, but his relationship with Rousseau is, I think, very interesting, and he asserts a deeply Rousseauian thought when he says, quote 25 on the handout, when he says that the people is only the people assembled. I think that's a deeply Rousseauian idea. There's a lot more to say about that, but just as an aside here, I think there's a certain amount of writing on Rousseau which wants to portray Rousseau as a theorist of constituent power, to use the phrase devised by the Abbé Sieyès in the context of the French Revolution, which has become a very, very important idea in terms of understanding how popular sovereignty works under modern representative government. I think the idea that Rousseau can be seen as a theorist of constituent power is fundamentally mistaken, because the whole point of constituent power, certainly as theorized by Sieyès, is that the people does not need to assemble. In fact, Sieyès is very much against the whole idea of the assembly of the people. And he has an entirely different idea, which is all about kind of differentiating between the people and its representatives and empowering the representatives of the people to think of themselves as an embodiment of the nation. Anyway, again, something perhaps we can talk about in discussion, but I think the trying to reinterpret Rousseau's thinking in terms of the language of constituent power is a big mistake. However, so that's one aspect of the means whereby a people maintains itself in existence, through assembly. But assembly, there's more to say about that. Let me just say a little bit more about it. What happens in the assembly of the people, most crucially, of course, is that the people votes. and the people votes by means of the formation of majorities. In other words, the people expresses its will through a majority vote. In other words, Rousseau doesn't imagine for a moment that the people will be unanimous. But he has a very distinctive understanding of how majority voting works, and in particular, how majority voting is compatible with the idea of autonomy for each individual citizen. Because it's very easy to think of majority voting in terms of precisely the kind of thing that Rousseauian politics is opposed to. In other words, it's very natural, especially after Tocqueville and Mill, to think of majority voting as a form of domination, a means by which the majority dominates or tyrannizes the minority. Rousseau is worried about that. He recognizes the potential problem, and he has a very, very distinctive understanding of how majority voting works and how the minority stands with respect to the majority. So this is something he discusses in chapter 2 of book 4 of the Social Contract. The crucial quote I've put on the handout there is quote 32. Rousseau's argument is that when the people votes and when a majority prevails over a minority, there's a sense in which, even though the minority disagreed in the moment of the vote, there is a sense in which more fundamentally and really the minority was mistaken about what its own will was, and that its will is always necessarily the will of the majority. The minority just kind of made a kind of epistemic mistake about its own will, and had it understood things better, it would understand that its will was the will of the majority. This presupposes that the majority are kind of voting in the right way, in Rousseauian terms, voting in terms of the interests of the political community at large, not out of factional interest. Minorities kind of misunderstands what the will of the people is, and when they reflect, they will see, according to Rousseau, that the majority will really was their will. Think of that's a very striking claim. It's as if here in Britain we had a referendum on our relationship with Europe. We voted to leave Europe. Those who voted against, those of us who wanted to stay part of Europe, it's as if Rousseau is saying, well, we just didn't really understand what we really wanted. More fundamentally, at some deeper level, we really wanted what the majority wanted. And that's sort of not how it feels to me when I reflect on the Brexit referendum. So what's going on here? How is this possible? And I think what's going on here, what this relies upon, is a very distinctive and strong theory of citizenship, whereby all citizens are thinking not in terms of factional interests or party interests, but all citizens are genuinely concerned above all with the interest of the community as a whole. So what goes along with Rousseau's theory of the people is a theory of citizenship, which a distinctive theory of citizenship. The people is made up of citizens, and Rousseauian citizens are rather unlike citizens as we know them in the modern world. That's not to say they're angels who are concerned only with the good of the people or whatever, but there's a strong ethical conception of citizenship where citizens are not primarily individuals, not primarily members of parties, but are first and foremost concerned with the good of the state as a whole. So it's a question: how do you make citizens like that? How do you make kind of selfish, greedy, limited people like we all are? How do you turn us into citizens in this sense? And Rousseau has a whole theory of education and of acculturation, a theory of religion and of art, which is meant to explain how citizens are created. I'm running out of time. Let me move towards a conclusion. The conclusion I draw from all of this is that the conditions that Rousseau imposes on peoplehood are not conditions that are met in the world as we know it, and they weren't met in the world as Rousseau knew it in his own time as well. So for Rousseau, it's a binary, politics is a binary matter. Either the people exists, is sovereign, either people's will determines how things go in politics, which requires, as I said, the people to assemble and to be continually willing to assert its will against government, to refuse government the capacity to make law in the name of the people, and so forth. Either all those conditions are satisfied, or the people as such simply does not exist. So I think the wrong way of understanding what's wrong with modern politics, according to Rousseau, the wrong way to describe it would be to say that the people is tyrannized by the government, or the people is oppressed by the government. That's a natural way of talking. We talk in that kind of way all the time, but it's not Rousseau's way of talking. I think he thinks the people is, by definition, not the kind of thing that can be tyrannized or oppressed. It's either sovereign or it's nothing. There are plenty of places where Rousseau says things like that. When he looks across the Channel at England, he doesn't see an English people that is oppressed by its government. He doesn't see a people at all. He just sees a government and individual members of the English nation with no people, as it were, peoplehood binding them together as a single thing. So that's the way I think Rousseau would understand modern politics, not in terms of the oppression of the people, but in terms of the lack of existence of a people. You just have governments and individuals and no people at all. That relationship between government and individuals is one of oppression and tyranny, sure. Rousseau looks around the Europe of his time and sees nothing but slavery, but it's not the slavery of peoples, it's the slavery of individuals. One final thought, what might be done about this, if you like, or what is the means whereby something approaching genuine popular sovereignty could be realized, according to Rousseau? There are two aspects, I think. One of the aspects, one is fairly familiar. I mentioned this right at the end of the lecture there. It's about the kind of moral condition of citizens. So Rousseau is often seen as being primarily a moralist who wants to educate citizens and make them less selfish, more patriotic, and so forth. I think all of that is true. But just as important, I think, is a question of constitutional design. So this is not such a familiar feature of Rousseauian politics, but I think it's absolutely essential that a Rousseauian polity needs to have a constitution which has right at its center the idea of the assembly of the people, regular assemblies of the people, whereby the people can assert its will over its government, assert its control over the constitution, and so forth. So a constitution which makes that kind of assembly of peoplehood possible is absolutely essential to Rousseauian politics. It's just not something that is, of course, a feature of the politics of the modern world as we know it. So to conclude, then, my suggestion is that Rousseau's theory of the people is demanding. It's difficult to realize. It involves the satisfaction of conditions that are not standardly realized in modern politics. Rousseau's, it's an explanation of, as it were, why peoples don't exist in the modern world as we know it. I'm not sure what Rousseau himself thought could be done about it, but I think the way to understand him is to see him as trying to prevent us from using this language in the way we talk about politics, and perhaps to be honest with ourselves and to see that the people, the supposed kind of fundamental entity of democracy, doesn't actually exist. I'll stop there. Thank you all for your attention. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor James. That was provocative. And as I told you before, Rousseau is one of the most read authors in Brazil. There's a very long tradition of Rousseauian reception here in Brazil. So I'm pretty sure we're going to have some questions here in the room. And before I can go on with the questions, I would like just to say in Portuguese a few things that I forgot before we start. I'll be right back with you. Bom, pessoal que está com a gente aqui na sala, pessoal do YouTube, eu acabei esquecendo quando fiz as apresentações, talvez um pouco por nervosismo, né, de dizer que essa palestra de hoje, essa lecture de hoje, só pode ser feita com a ajuda e orientação da professora Isabel Limonge. Isso está acontecendo no âmbito do grupo, né, de pesquisa no seminário da professora Isabel Limonge, que é o grupo Estado e Sociedade. E daí, pela temática do grupo, vocês entendem, né, por que o professor James selecionou exatamente esse artigo que ele está trabalhando, né? Então, é isso, com o apoio do Departamento de Filosofia da Universidade Federal do Paraná e com a participação majoritária dos membros desse grupo, com alguns convidados bastante qualificados, como o professor Marcos Ballier, o professor Ricardo Monteagudo, está lá no YouTube também. Então, me deixa muito feliz que a gente tenha conseguido trazer o professor James e que a gente possa organizar essas reuniões no âmbito do grupo Estado e Sociedade da professora Bel, que é minha orientadora no doutorado da Universidade Federal do Paraná. We have a couple of questions already here, and I'm going to start with Professor Isabel, which is my supervisor, Professor James. Would you like to do it in English, Professor Bell?
Thank you very much. I will try in English, and if I have problems, I ask you for help, but I will try. James Harris, thank you very much. Your speech has a lot to do with our concerns, as Flávio told in Portuguese now. We are, all of us, the group of the students that I supervise, we are thinking about the relationship between the concrete people, and we say society, and this juridical people unified in the state, we would say. So thank you very much. Your speech has a lot to do with that. And I will ask you about the relationship Hobbes and Rousseau. You start saying that they are, I don't remember the expression, not opposites, but they are in different degrees of acceptions of people. And I used to think these authors as in relationship.
Yes.
Because the question you put to Rousseau is a Hobbesian question, because for Hobbes, as for Rousseau, that's the problem. People is only a convention.
Yes.
That means that it does not exist, really. I think in Hobbes, that's a very important distinction, physical world and juridical world. And the question is just the relationship of these words.
Yeah.
And Rousseau, how I say herdou? Herdeiro is
Rousseau inherited
this problem, isn't it? So I wouldn't say that Rousseau is more exigent about the union of the people. He has a different conception of the nation or society. In a way, he says through education or through assembly, as you told, how to construct this unity in the plan of the nation or society.
Yeah.
And Hobbes is absolutely, I would say pessimist, but he has another way to think the social relations that tends to war, to isolation. And so that's my question. The difference is not in the theory of people as a convention,
Okay,
but the conception of the nation or society. Thank you. Thank you.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot to say about this. I absolutely agree with you that Rousseau is a kind of Hobbesian political thinker in important ways. I mean, despite their superficial differences, there are some profound similarities. I completely agree about that. They both, as you say, think about peoplehood in the same way as unity, as singleness of will. They disagree about how singleness of will is created, and I try to say something about that. There's a nice phrase that the German historian Otto von Guericke, he talks about Hobbes as collapsing the dualism of traditionally you had the people and you had the king, and they were two separate juridical entities, and Hobbes collapses that dualism such that the people simply is the king and the king is the people. That does the same thing. I think Rousseau is trying to reopen that distinction between people and government, to use his phrase, such that even where Rousseau is open to the idea of monarchical government, as you know, but he's very insistent that king and people are entirely separate things. Your question is about, as well, the other term in this binary opposition, not people but nation, or not people but multitude. If I understand you correctly, so your suggestion was that the real difference between Rousseau and Hobbes is in their theory of the nation. And I agree. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. There's I don't know whether I've got it on the handout or not. There's a quote where Rousseau talks about the nation. It's a quote from book 2, chapter. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so Rousseau talks about the nation as unified in a loose sense. I think unified, not strictly. It doesn't become a single moral person, but the nation is unified by history, by language, by culture, perhaps by a kind of shared understanding of purpose and so forth. I think so. I think there's a difference there between the Rousseauian nation and the Hobbesian state of nature, if you like. The Hobbesian state of nature is a state of conflict and war of all against all and so forth, and that's not Rousseau's understanding of the nation. And he's got a complicated, I think one way of understanding what's going on in the second discourse, on the discourse on inequality, is, as it were, a kind of story of nationhood, if you like, according to Rousseau, a history of nationhood, the various stages of the history of the nation. And of course, the kind of Hobbesian state of nature is just one moment in that history of the nation. So I hope I'm agreeing with you that there's a kind of Rousseau has. I mean, another way of putting this would be to say that Hobbes doesn't have a theory of nationhood. Not really. Certainly not as something different and distinct from the people. He's no interest in culture and history, really, as sort of forces of union. Whereas Rousseau definitely does. I don't know. Sorry, I should stop speaking. But these are interesting questions. But the more fundamental question here is how does one sort of correctly characterize the relationship between Rousseau and Hobbes? And it's a very difficult question to get it absolutely right. Thank you.
Professor Marcos, fica à vontade.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor Harris. That was very thought-provoking. I'll go straight to the point. Considering what Rousseau says that people should be, well, are there any actual people in the world at all?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think his theory is really good when it comes to criticize certain aspects of the state and of politics, but I wonder if anything really constructive comes out of that. You know what I mean? That's it.
Okay. Thank you. It's a question I think about myself a lot. Like another way of putting the question would be like, what's the point? What is Rousseau telling us about the world? What are we supposed to do with his political thinking? I think that's a really interesting question. What's the point? Yeah. I think a good answer to this question is given by Judith Shklar in her book on Rousseau. I mean, she sees Rousseau as a deeply pessimistic, almost tragic political thinker. And, I think what he's doing is, and I mentioned this right at the end of my talk, he's asking us to be careful about the language that we use to talk about politics. He says, for example, if you want to use the language of equality or the language of popular sovereignty, this is what you have to mean by that language. And it's a pretty extreme theory. It's very demanding. It's hard to see how those ideas can really be realized in our world. And I think the same goes for peoplehood, the supposed possessor of sovereignty. The idea that there are things called peoples is very important to us when we understand ourselves as democracies. We want to see our politics as somehow, in some sort of fundamental sense, controlled by the will of the people. And as I understand Rousseau anyway, he's, I guess, warning us, telling us that, it's peoples are not natural things. It's a real question how such a thing as a people can exist. And, maybe then the wrong way of understanding our politics is in terms of peoplehood. I mean, maybe, we just shouldn't be using that language to talk about our politics. We should use some other word. We should recognize that really our politics is about a kind of a Marxist, way of thinking about, there's nothing about peoplehood. It's about the conflict between classes, and that's what politics really is. And I think Rousseau would kind of potentially be open to that thought. Or politics is essentially about the conflict between factions, and an election is really always just about the victory of one faction over another. It's never about the victory of the people. The people's just irrelevant to understand. So I think I understand Rousseau as not kind of giving us a way to turn our politics into his politics. I think that's pretty much impossible. I think he's just asking us to be, as I say, to be careful about the language that we use in our politics. That's all. Thank you for your question. Though I have the same question myself.
We have 2 more questions, Professor. Agatha, would you like to ask straight to Professor James? Would like to send your question em português? The way you feel more comfortable, you can go ahead. Eu falei em inglês, né, Agatha?
Não, tudo bem, eu entendi. Bom, eu vou enviar ali no chat, então, em português, e vou tentar a pronúncia em inglês, porque como eu notifiquei. Okay. So, before my question, I must express my interest gratitude to Mr. James for his presence and the opportunity to hear a listener. My question concerns the concept of general will, which ends on begin the main way to the body corporate acts. However, during the social contract, another will BPhil general will is mentioned several times. The will of the body, or will of the group. Can will tell me how the fits on Rousseau ways for imagining these people commonly?
Did you get that, Professor James, or would you like me to translate it? Because
just one more time. Thank you, Flavio.
Yeah. Okay. So before my question, I should say I'm grateful for the presence of Mr. James and the opportunity to be here as a listener. My question is about the concept of the general will, that ends up being the main form of acting of the political body.
Yeah.
But during the social contract, it is mentioned several times that beyond the general will, being that of the body, could you tell me where it fits in this way to imagine the people of which Rousseau thought so much?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, the body will and the general will, the relationship of this concept.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes. Well, I didn't say very much about the general will. It's a very difficult, it's possibly Rousseau's kind of great contribution to history of political thought. But it's also very controversial. Any interpretation of the general will is controversial. So I think, well, first thing to say is that the general will, is the will of the people. I mean, these are 2 ways, I think, of talking about the same thing. But I think it's really important to see Rousseau as thinking of the general will, the will of the people, as being something which has to be continually exercised. The will of the people is not, a fact, something which can be sort of written down and kind of preserved through time in that way. The will of the people is sort of an inherently active matter. It's the people exercising its will, and there's only a general will insofar as that will is being exercised by the people. So there's a nice quote, I've got it somewhere on the handout. I like this quote a lot. So this is quote 28 on the handouts. There's a quotation from an article by an American scholar called Stephen Affeldt. He says, will is only and essentially a current will. Its time is always now. And there's another quote by Louis Althusser in his one of his studies of Rousseau, quote 30, where where he talks about the fact that sort of peoplehood, the creation of a peoplehood through the formation of a general will, is not a historical moment. It's, as he says, is an always contemporary primordial moment, which relives in each of the acts of the sovereign the expression of the general will. So this is the idea that the general will is an activity. It's a willing of the people's sense of its general interest. So there are other questions about the general will, of course, but that is kind of how I think about it, as not a kind of, not a result or a product, but as an activity. It's the people. There is a general will when the people is together, thinking, voting. That's where and when the general will is. So that's, I don't know if that really helps with the question, but that's how I think about the general will. I mean, there is where there is no general will, where there is no such thing, the people doesn't exist. So peoplehood, the kind of union, the unity that is peoplehood, exists in this moment of general willing. So no general will, no people. There is, without a general will, the political community stops being a people and just reverts to being either a kind of atomized collection of individuals or a war between factions. But that's, as it were, the what happens when there is no longer a general will. But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I didn't say enough about this. It's just very hard to I find it very hard to talk about the general will. It's a very mysterious concept, very hard to make proper sense of it. But that's how I think about it anyway.
Well, we have one last question here in the group, which is Romulu's question. So go ahead, Romulo.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor Harris, for the presentation. It was very interesting. And I would like to focus on that part that you had to you had to pass through a little bit, and would like to come back to the aspects of the citizenship for Rousseau.
Right. Yes.
And how it is not only profoundly ethic or ethically deep, but very demanding. The citizen for Rousseau is a very demanding person in the social structure. And I would like to think, or maybe I start to think about it on the focusing on the passionate aspects of the citizen, because the citizen has to be interest in the general being, in the collective interest of the people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is hard to see how being interested in the general assembly or collection of the people, he would lack a self-interest himself, in a sense, or maybe making it easier. I would like to ask about the problem of the passion of the individual, self-love, love of self, how these dynamics would be worked or dealt into your thought here in the foundation of the people.
Thank you. No, I think it's a really important question. Yeah. So, as you say, I mean, Rousseau has a demanding theory of citizenship, but I think it's possible to exaggerate how demanding it is. So I don't think that he imagines that the citizen has no thought of himself or herself, has no self-interest at all. It's not that demanding. I don't think citizenship involves this kind of radical overcoming of the self, where suddenly you have no conception of yourself outside of your citizenship, outside of the interest of the country. So there are interpretations of Rousseau who read him in that way. They tend to be kind of hostile readings of Rousseau. I think in particular of, say, Isaiah Berlin's reading of Rousseau, which is meant to show how Rousseau is a theorist of a pure theorist of positive liberty, not negative liberty, and of course, for Berlin, that's not really a theory of liberty at all. So I think we don't need to go that far. So I see it more as a matter of citizenship involving, I think one way of thinking about it is to think about voting and how to understand voting in an election. Am I voting out of my own interests, or am I voting out of my sense of what's good for the country as a whole? And I think Rousseauian citizenship is very much about the second thing. It's about voting out of one sense of the country, the good of the country as a whole. And the good of the country as a whole is not, I think, I guess here we go back to the question of the general will. It's not a radical transcendence of people's interests as if they don't matter anymore. It's more a matter of trying to find how the place where all of our interests are compatible with each other, where they come together, such that in some sense we all have the same interests. So, of course, we're going to have interests which set us apart, which are different. My interests will be different from yours in certain important respects, but as citizens, we share the same interests, the interests of the nation as a whole. So I see it as a kind of, and in a way, again, this is a question of the relationship between Rousseau and Hobbes. To what extent does Rousseau's understanding of the moral psychology of citizenship, how far is that a radical rejection of Hobbes? How much of Hobbes's moral psychology is still present in Rousseau? Some people read Rousseau, in direct contradiction to the way I just mentioned, as a kind of pure Hobbesian, as a pure self-interest theorist. Again, I think that's too extreme in the other direction. So yeah, I agree that this is a central question. And to me, the right way is to find a kind of way of thinking about Rousseauian citizenship, which both recognizes that it requires cultivation, it has an ethical dimension, it's different from ordinary self-interest. Citizens have to be created. It requires a special form of acculturation. So that's all true. But on the other hand, I don't think it involves like a completely a kind of radical dissolution of self, such that you no longer have any thoughts of yourself at all. So it's some kind of middle position, I think, between those extremes. At least that's what I kind of hope his theory of citizenship is. I mean, it's striking. So there is this thing that he says in Emile. It's quote 3 on the handout, where he says the word citizen should be effaced from modern languages. There are no citizens in the modern world. Rousseau says. I think it's a very, there's a direct connection between that and the thought that there aren't any peoples in the modern world. If there aren't any citizens, there can't be any peoples, according to Rousseau. Citizenship is demanding. It's not a natural thing. It no longer exists, according to Rousseau. What it would take to create citizens, like I say, there are a number of answers to that question, but I don't think it involves a kind of, as I say, a kind of radical transformation of the self. It's extreme, but it's not that extreme. But thank you for your question.
Professor James, we don't have questions from the YouTube guys. It's just a lot of hellos and thank yous, but no questions formulated at this time. So I just like to say that it was a pleasure to have you. You were always very generous. So, and I honestly hope this was a good experience for you too. And perhaps in the future, we could expand it a little bit and make a small seminar involving students from Brazil and from Scotland, or maybe we could participate in the early modern Scottish seminar, as Veronica and I had the opportunity. Maybe we can make it a hybrid event, and of course we can talk about that by email as we usually communicate. And I'm guessing I speak for everybody here saying that it was very nice, to be able to hear from you from such a long distance and such an important day with your personal commitments. And thank you for taking the time to speak to us. And I guess it's farewell. And
let me thank you all for being here, for listening, for asking me questions. It's been a great experience for me too. So thank you, Flavia, for setting this up. And thank you all for, it was good to meet you all in this strange way.
Yeah. Well, perhaps one day we can, travel around, and perhaps more students from here can go to Scotland and live the experience that I. Posso pedir para os brasileiros que tenham interesse rapidinho ficar depois que o professor James sair, e eu acho que Mari pode encerrar lá o YouTube. Né? We're just